So, welcome, colleagues and comrades. My name is Andile Zulu, and today we are having quite a useful seminar on energy, climate justice, and neither justice nor transition in the just transition. Presenting this for us is Sean Sweeney, or rather, I should say, Professor Sean Sweeney, who's the Director of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, which is an organization that advocates for a public pathway approach to energy transition, climate protection, and combating energy poverty. Sean Sweeney is also the director of the International Program for Labor, Climate, and Environment at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at, uh, at City University of New York. He is a long-time leading trade unionist and climate and energy activist. Originally from the UK, Sean joined us here today at the Alternative Information and Development Center. So we will have Sean's presentation, followed by a series of questions and answers to provoke some discussion. Sean, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Andile, for that introduction. And thanks, Jeff, for setting this meeting up, and comrades in the room and comrades on Zoom. I'm going to build the presentation around a broad analysis. I won't be focusing just on South Africa. I think that the world trends are really important to fully understand. And there's it's asking me to unmute myself, but I don't want to do that. Ignore that. Ignore that. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to get that out of the way. So first of all, a bit about trade unions for energy democracy. It was set up in 2012, which is 13 or so years ago now. Sorry, 11 or so years ago now. And it was set up because the trade union movement was divided over how to deal with climate change. It was divided along many fault lines. And the dominant sort of view that came mostly from European trade unions was that the green economy, green growth was good because it would address the climate crisis, which needed to be addressed, and then there would be a lot of jobs. So our job as a movement is to get a seat at the table and make sure that the workers who are going to be negatively affected by climate policy, coal miners, for example, would be protected in one form or another. And also that the new jobs, green jobs, would be of good quality, where there's a right to unionize, collective bargaining, etc. It was a pretty narrow agenda, but it assumed that the transition to a low carbon future was inevitable. This was the narrative of the period of around about 2010, 11, 12. We are coming out of a global recession, depression in some cases, due to the financial crisis. And then what happens is you get this narrative of green growth. So if we're going to recover from the crisis of 2007, 2008, which sent shockwaves around the capitalist system, if we're going to recover from that, then we should be doing it green. And that was the sort of the basic narrative. And a lot of unions supported that. They thought that was a good idea. But in 2012, there was a big meeting in Brazil for the Rio Plus 20 years prior to 2012, 1992. There was the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where the problems of the environment were put on the table, including climate change, and there was discussion about how to deal with that crisis. And of course, the dominant view of the time was the markets will solve all of these problems. All we need to do is provide incentives for the green economy, wind, solar power, for example, and disincentives for fossil fuel companies, put a price on carbon. A very much hands-off, let's just do the stick, which was the carbon price, and the carrot, which was the incentives. All would be resolved by the market with government policy going in the right direction. So the analysis that came out of Chewed was that, first of all, the energy transition is not inevitable. In fact, what we observed in TUED when we formed the project that wasn't even anywhere in the discourse except in small circles was that there was an energy expansion going on. In other words, renewables were growing, but so was every other form of energy, coal, oil, gas. And we put that analysis out there, and it met some resistance even within the trade unions, because there was a belief that, well, if we say it's not happening, then everybody's going to get depressed, and they won't fight for green jobs, social dialogue, just transition. So we said, look, the reality has to be faced up to, and we cannot just hide from it, because we want to send a positive message to our members that they're on the right side or correct side of history. Now this then, because the expansion of energy is going on, it means emissions continue to rise, and I want to show a few visuals on that in a moment. But it shone a very bright light for us on the failure of neoliberal policy. We say failure, but it's really an ineffective policy in terms of controlling emissions. So the market-led, investor-focused policies have been a complete failure. And the last part of the TUED message is we need an alternative. And that alternative is not in a few slogans. It's not in, you can't put it on an infographic, really. It needs to be explained what we mean by a public pathway alternative, and that has been evolving over the last number of years. So that's just a way of a little intro on the TUED perspective. And now I can't move the slides. Oh, sorry. Very good. Now, just to say very quickly, this is the International Trade Union Confederation World Congress in Melbourne. They said Congress commits to work for the retention, reclamation, and expansion of public ownership of energy, infrastructure, and services. Now, I put that there because this is very recent development. It doesn't change the world, but it illustrates how the trade union narrative has begun to change. 10 years ago, when we started TUED, if we said we need public ownership of energy, they would say, oh no, we don't need that. That's not necessary. Everything's going to be, everything's going forward. We can't stop the neoliberal policy framework. We don't really want to stop it. If it provides jobs and gives us a seat at the table, then that's fine. So that was the narrative was coming out of the more conservative unions of the global north. In the global south, what they saw was more extractivism, more exploitation, more devastation of natural resources, more trampling on rural communities, and so on. So completely different situation. Now, I'll fast forward to about 4 years ago. I think the first meeting was in this room of the reference group consisting of AIDC, Transnational Institute, TUED, and NUM, NUMSA, and one or two other unions were part of this reference group that was looking at the whole question of the Eskom's crisis and what was needed to address, first of all, the load shedding crisis, but also the fact that South Africa still is a major coal burner, and there was a lot of talk at the time of the need to transition away from coal towards renewables. And many in the environmental movement, NGOs, went along with that, didn't question didn't challenge the efforts to really disrupt Eskom as a public entity. And this analysis in the Eskom Transformed, I think, has held up very well. And it points to why a well-resourced, flexible, transparent, democratically controlled, modern public utility is not just a dream, it's an absolutely essential component of a decarbonization, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. The policy that was and still is in the discourse at the moment is you disrupt, and the word disrupt is their word. You disrupt the big public companies because of their association with fossil fuels. We don't need big power anymore. We just do behind the meter, what they call distributed generation. And there's plenty of sun and there's plenty of wind, and all we need to do is have the political will to put the panels in the wind turbines. Obviously, I'm being very simplistic, but that was the narrative. And a lot of progressive people went along with that. They see Eskom, they see coal, they see corruption, they see state capture. Same in public utilities all over the world. The ones, many of them are not in such a bad shape as Eskom, but they were facing this disruption, policy of disruption, on the belief that that kind of power was that kind of centralized power was no longer necessary. So there's a technical dimension to this debate, comrades, which I have to say, and I'm mea culpa, when we started Chewed, I had no idea about the technical dimensions. When someone said, oh, you can't do this because you can't do all this wind and solar because of it would be variable power. I used to dismiss that. I used to say, that's just you. You're probably sympathetic to the fossil fuel companies. So I had that prejudice as well. I was influenced by those forces, the green movement, etc. But the more the TrueEd network grew and became more knowledgeable, and we began to listen to unions in the energy sector, the more you can see there are technical challenges that we need to come to terms with. And those challenges are embedded in the 100% renewable energy scenario that have been put forward by the big NGOs that we should return to. So we said that Eskom is absolutely essential. It needs to be part of a planned transition away from coal. It needs to deal with the technical challenges and have an open discussion on all available technologies. But we said something else in Eskom Transform, and I want to segue into this dimension, which that the global reality of energy transition had been full of erroneous information and misrepresentation in the South African context. And we wanted to address that. Because if you listen to certain individuals, and I won't name them, but you know what I'm talking about, certain individuals who are in the public domain here in South Africa, they depict South Africa as a laggard, as being lagging behind everybody else. Everybody else is doing the energy transition and it's going so well. It's madness that there are people in South Africa who want to continue with Eskom, who want to defend and repair Eskom, that what we really should be doing is opening up, and you hear these terms on the TV and the radio every day in South Africa, opening up the the market for electricity so that all of the private sector companies can come in, small and large, and everybody will be part of the energy system, and it will accelerate the transition. So what we said in Eskom Transformed, which stands the test of time, but it needs to be updated somewhat, is that what we're seeing globally is the energy expansion continuing, the use of coal, oil, and gas continuing to grow, but also really a crisis in the renewable energy economy, largely due to the fact that if we look at the idea, for example, that wind and solar is inexpensive. So let's start with that. So it's cheaper than coal. Interestingly, what's normally put forward is it's not cheaper than coal, it's cheaper than new coal. So watch out for these little words in the discourse. They can be quite disarming. You can be misled when you listen to these arguments being put forward in the media. New coal means if you build a new coal power station now, and it takes 10 years, and you've got to borrow the money to build a new coal-fired power station, it's going to generate electricity at a certain price. And if you do renewables now and borrow capital, and it's going to generate electricity at a certain price. Now, the comparisons have been made, and they're fairly convincing that renewables are cheaper than new coal. But we're not talking about new coal. We're talking about an existing coal fleet that supplies 85% or so of South Africa's power. And so the idea that you can disrupt Eskom by undermining its market and forcing it to compete with, or rather purchase power from independent power producers, is going to lead to a lot of problems. But beyond that, if we look at the whole economics of renewable energy, it's becoming much more expensive than was originally thought. Because if you put wind and solar on the grid, you need transmission and distribution cables. Who's going to pay for that? It's this world policy leaders, energy policy leaders, are just beginning to understand there is such a thing as a transmission system. They really paid no attention to it, and I'm not exaggerating. Fatih Birol, who's the head of the International Energy Agency, said he went to a meeting, it was last week in Belgium, where you had the offshore wind industry, was talking about what needed to be done to upgrade the transmission systems to bring all the renewable energy into the grid. Remember, in the case of South Africa, where are the wind corridors? They're nowhere near where the load, where the demand is going to be. So this is going to present some problems even in South Africa. In countries like Germany, they closed down their entire nuclear fleet, something like 16 gigawatts of nuclear power prematurely, because they thought that wind and solar was going to replace the power. Now they've got a problem. They've got resistance to large wind farms in northern Germany, but they also have resistance to the transmission lines, because these transmission lines, they cut through entire forested areas, and you can see these big gouge marks where they like basically chop the trees down, build these pylons, and then the transmission lines go from north to south. Now they're talking about building the transmission lines underground to avoid that problem. So what you see is a complete lack of planning of the energy transition and an element of chaos that's creeping in. So what we said in Eskom Transform that really stands up today, you cannot do a transition without planning, and you cannot do it on the basis of investors making money, because that means final investment decisions will be in the hands of those investors, not in the hands of an elected government, however bad that government might be. So we also said basically that the renewable sector was facing a crisis. Now let's have a look then at climate commitments. So you've all seen charts like this. This is what's needed in terms of CO2 emissions from 2020, which is gone now, to 2055 or 24. So this is in line with the sort of the net zero commitments and how the trajectory of emissions, which has been going up now for 200 years and doubled in the last 30 years, that trajectory needs to go into sharply different direction. So that's the technical challenge associated with climate change. How do we get CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions under control and coming down very, very rapidly indeed? Now, here's a chart which I found yesterday. So when we talk about energy expansion, not energy transition, the chart there on the right is China. Now, this isn't to pick on China because this is typical of a lot of the high growth economies. They're largely using fossil fuels. They are growing their renewables sector, but as you can see, the energy expansion, this is just electricity generation, not to say nothing about the fossil fuel use across the entire economy, for example, in transport, heating, cooling, etc. And you can see also on the left the five-fold interest in the consumption of electricity globally. Now, of course, a lot of that is a good thing. Many people got electricity in the last 50 years who didn't have electricity. But you can also see that what the main suppliers of that electricity are coal and gas, and that continues to be the case. What I would change, and this is from a headline from 2021, this I think illustrates the energy expansion argument, is that renewable power is growing at record speeds. And if you left the sentence there, you would be forgiven for believing that there is a transition underway and it's only a matter of time before fossil fuels disappear. But what we also see is that emissions from, in this case, power stations they're also at their highest level. So this is basically connected to energy demand. This is world coal consumption. It only goes up to 2021, but I can tell you that in 2023, there'll be more coal burned. There was more coal burned in 2023 than any point in human history. But this isn't what an energy transition looks like. This is an energy expansion, and I don't want to belabor the point, but when we come up against the sort of the happy talk in the media, and you hear people saying, "Oh, it's spreading like wildfire, the green energy," then we are not dealing with the entire political economy and its demand for energy. So you can see there that world consumption of coal went down under COVID, but it's now back up. I'll just reminisce a little bit. In 2015, Nicholas Stern, who's the former chief economist of the World Bank, said that China was entering a period of post-coal growth. I'm sort of thinking, well, what does that mean? You know, that post-coal, there won't be any more coal? And it's comical how these terms get spread around as though they're reality. China quadrupled its coal use from 1990 to 2015. Because coal consumption went down a few percentage points in 1 year because of a deep recession in China, they said, we've turned the corner. If we can turn the corner in China, everywhere can do it. And that, again, is, comrades, we have to be really attentive when we listen to this and don't accept it as true. It's wishful thinking and it's dangerous thinking. This is one of my favorite charts, or to be honest, it only goes up to 2019. You can see this is total energy consumption, and the little red down there is wind, and you can't really see solar, and you can see biomass, and you can see hydro. So this is total energy consumption. It's not just the electricity sector, it's the transport sector and everything else. Now, the numbers may have changed in the last 3 or 4 years, granted, but you can see which way things are going. These are CO2 emissions. It doesn't matter, Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, whatever the agreement, whatever the commitments, unfortunately, and I say this with no satisfaction whatsoever, it is not making a difference and not making a meaningful difference. We've got a problem here of rising emissions, which again will reach record level in 2023. The only sector of the economy where you can say there's some kind of decarbonization going on is the electricity sector. And renewables have grown. Modern renewables are now about 12% of global electricity supply, which is a big improvement on 10 years ago when it was 6%, but it's still nowhere near the pace that low carbon, let's put it more broadly, low carbon energy needs to go in order to have an effect on emissions levels. Some people have talked, and just a digression here, on electric vehicles, that now it's 1 in 5 of all new car sales are electric. Just 4 years ago, it was 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 car sales. But it doesn't alter the fact that there was 46 million new vehicles in China alone last year. So you've got a massive growth so the percentage may be going up, but the volume of vehicles is going up dramatically, and most of them, 4 out of 5 of current sales, are internal combustion engine. And transport is now the fastest growing source of CO2 emissions of any other sector. It's the fastest. Now, on the question of the Global South, with CHUED, we launched in October 2022 in Nairobi. We brought unions together to deal with the special challenges of the South. When we say deal with it, it's really a coming together and talking about what programmatic approaches can we take to deal with this. What we identified was the energy expansion was particularly strong in Asia Pacific region, with a 4, 5, 6% increase in energy use annually, and that was being mostly met by fossil fuels. In sub-Saharan Africa, we've got a completely different problem. We've got inadequate sources of energy, inadequate means of creating energy, electricity in particular, and 1 billion people or so without electrical power. So we tried to deal with those twin questions. Now, what we're seeing as in terms of the current approach to power systems, which I think can give us some hope, is that what is being proposed for South Africa and through these just energy transition partnerships is that It's a structural adjustment agenda. It basically says, you, Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, less so in Vietnam's case, Senegal, one or two other countries, you got no money to pay for your own transition. So we're going to lend you some money and you're going to basically get off of coal because you're the biggest coal users. Your coal use is growing where ours in the global north is shrinking. That's true. So the argument was, you've got to get off of coal. And that was the message that came through the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership that was presented at COP26 in November 2021. You may remember the headlines, and it's been in the news ever since. And a word or so on that, because I think it's important to look at what was on the table. I'm sure comrades online and in the room are familiar with some of the things that were said. But if you'll remember, the president in 2019, February 2019, in the State of the Nation address, said that he was going to convene a climate change committee consisting of unions and other stakeholders. And that climate change committee was going to discuss a just transition for South Africa's energy system. In the same speech, 5 minutes later, he said that the plan was to break up Eskom, unbundle Eskom into generation, transmission, and distribution. Why was that necessary? The president said, and of course I'm paraphrasing him, he said, because it would be easier for Eskom to raise money from the private markets if it was 3 separate divisions. Now that, again, is classic World Bank policy. That's their policy that they developed in the 1990s. And as we've shown through the work of Chued South, that has been an absolute disaster all across the region. All of the utilities are bankrupt. There's only 2 countries that have managed to break even in terms of their operating costs, not their investment costs, but their operating costs. And that's Uganda and the Seychelles Islands. Now, I don't know about you, but Seychelles Islands is hardly typical of an sub-Saharan African country. Population 100,000, of which 40,000 work in tourism. So yes, they can maybe charge more for their electricity. The tourists don't mind paying. But Uganda, which was a poster child of privatization, has now taken moves to renationalize its power systems. So what is being presented in the debate on the Just Energy Transition Partnership here is basically that South Africa needs to catch up with everybody else. But what's happening in other parts of the world is very interesting. And we're seeing countries realize that the whole system of independent power producers and power purchase agreements, and if these terms are unfamiliar to comrades, I'm happy to come back to them later. That whole system is punishing the utilities, making electricity prices a lot higher. So governments are in a situation where they either allow for electricity prices to go up in order to pay the independent power producers or go into further retting and themselves. So this is the logic behind the bailouts of Eskom. There are many problems with Eskom, but one of them is they're paying something like $5 million a day buying power from independent power producers at way above market rates. So this system is of independent power producers, and these power purchase contracts must end, and they are part of the public pathway alternative. Now, where else in the world is the struggle for energy unfolding, and what's happening? So we saw, this is 2 years ago in France, the Énergie de France is the EDF is the national company. It's been partially privatized, but most of it is still in public hands. The union there led a campaign against Macron's efforts to privatize the public system. The unions were successful, Macron backed off, and now Macron is actually talking about more renationalization of EDF because of the crisis in the Ukraine and the threat to gas supplies in Europe. They want to rebuild the nuclear fleet and even add more nuclear reactors in France. France is about 85% nuclear power. It's one of the nuclear, if you like, it's probably the country with the highest concentration of nuclear power in terms of its energy mix that I can think of. The second largest is the US. So that was a successful campaign. In Ghana's case, the utility was so in debt to the independent power producers. Remember, these producers come in and they will only set up shop in your country if you give them a 25-year or 30-year contract to purchase power at a fixed price over the length of that contract. And they do that because they need to, basically, they've got high interest rates, they have to borrow money, they have to pay back, but they also have to pay dividends and profits and make as much money as they can, as quickly as they can, in order to keep the investment going. So the power purchase agreement is absolutely crucial from the point of view of the independent power producers. Countries like Ghana, and they're not alone, were then locked into these contracts. It cost a lot of money. And Ghana chose to basically cut its losses, pay $450 million in fines to the IPPs to cancel the contracts in order to avoid paying high electricity prices well into the 2030s. So this was a kind of a emblematic case. And one of the perverse ironies, here's you have a country where half the population doesn't have electricity, and the World Bank is saying, well, you've got surplus electricity. Well, of course, from a market perspective, there was surplus electricity. And it meant that the surplus in the IPPs was being purchased by the utility under that contract. I could go on, but Uganda is another country that's moving to nationalize its electricity utility because the contracts with IPPs are ending. Honduras has cancelled its renewable energy, the equivalent of the REI4P. It's been cancelled in Honduras for the same reason. The headline, of course, is business media saying that that's a setback. The reform is a setback. This, I think, is, I said this a few times, the example of what I would call conscious renationalization with purposeful intent is Mexico. A lot of the other countries that are renationalizing are doing it on the fly. They look at the contracts and they say, oh, we're going more and more into debt, let's cancel the contracts. But that doesn't add up to an energy transition. It doesn't add up to a planned transition away from fossil fuels or to allow to address energy poverty. It's an impromptu response, not a thought out response. But in the case of AMLO, this is the president of Mexico. A little bit of background on AMLO. AMLO was basically on the left. They formed, the left haven't been in power in Mexico for many decades. And neoliberal administrations have come in and they spent a lot of time trying to privatize the power system. AMLO come in and said the policy of national plunder stops here, and he basically cancelled the contracts with independent power producers. And a lot of that, the reason for that were technical. They were basically building wind and solar farms, being guaranteed to be paid for the electricity, even though the electricity was not being used because it couldn't get into the grids. So the grids were not ready. Vietnam did the same thing, cancelled a lot of its renewable energy projects because the grids were not ready. So this is, again, like building, you know, a super fast car but not having a road to drive it on. It's ludicrous lack of planning, and it's slowing up the energy transition. So that AMLO, for his sins, got this letter from the Department of State. The Biden administration wrote to AMLO saying, you know, we've tried to be constructive with you, but you keep making it difficult for US businesses in Mexico by, you know, basically canceling their contracts. And ironically, he got better a deal out of Trump than he got out of Biden. But anyway, what Mexico did recently in the last 6 months is nationalize the interests of the Spanish multinational Iberdrola in gas and renewables. And also, this is the largest solar park in Latin America. It's currently 400 megawatts. It's fully publicly owned by the state of Sonora and the Mexican federal government, and it will grow to 1.1 gigawatts. So we're talking about pretty large renewable projects done under public control. A model I would suggest for South Africa. Now, this is a World Bank. I came across this document. This is the World Bank Implementation, Completion and Results Report on a loan in the amount of $3,750 million. Now, you know what that loan was for. That was Medupe and Kusile. So that loan, but this is a report on the performance of the loan. It says, carefully prepared and packaged public sector owned renewable energy projects can produce results comparable to those of IPPs of the same vintage. Now that should be headline news in South Africa, because what it really means is, and this is actually trying to make the best case. This is a World Bank report, the World Bank that's been pushing privatization of electricity for 30 years, produces a report that says, you know what? It might have been better if we did it public all along. We might be in a lot better position now in terms of planning the transition. So there are cracks in the neoliberal energy transition model. There are movements towards a public pathway. Unions are leading that struggle, but we can't exaggerate it because although they're the ones on paper supporting the public pathway, NUM, COSATU, NUMSA, in one form or another say it, sometimes explicitly. They're not mobilizing and organizing around it, but they are at least have some kind of answer to the ongoing destabilization of Eskom. So I think I could go on about the Reclaim and Restore initiative, but I think in the interest of time and for the audience outside the room, I'll stop there and maybe we can, what happens next?
Thank you, Sean. So thank you, Sean, for that comprehensive inputs that touches on a series of, I think, very contentious issues, and kind of revealed how far behind public discourse in South Africa at least is on the question of energy and the just transition. So I think what is best to do is to give people on Zoom some time to formulate their questions. And what we can do in the meantime is to first take some questions, points, or inputs from the room. So comrades, the floor is open to you. Don't be surprised if I approach you if you raise your hand. The lapel mic has to be near to you so people on Zoom can hear you. So now is the time for you to raise your points, questions, and inputs.
Feel free to push back on anything I said or chime in. I won't want you to drink that.
Just hold it. Do I hold it? Yeah, just hold it.
Sean, listening to you, my only regret is that there's so few of us to have heard what you had to say. So thank you very much. An equal number, if not larger number, on Zoom. So let's hope they will have the questions. But in the meantime, perhaps just a comment. A comment about electric vehicles. Because it's something that I've been tracking for a while, and the current position, surprise, surprise, within a capitalist monopoly economies, is that there's an oversupply, a serious oversupply or lack of demand for electric vehicles. So much so that there's a price war going on in China between the Chinese electric car manufacturers and Tesla. And as far as I understand it, here I might be wrong, I've always had the understanding that monopolies are totally opposed to cutting prices. They will do any other form of getting a competitive advantage, but not cut prices. But in China, there's a price cut war as something, perhaps just a measure of how serious the situation is. Apart from the fact, of course, that we talk about electric cars, we seldom talk about, well, and how are the batteries charged?
Right.
Well, unless they're charged by renewable sources, I don't know much about out of South Africa, but guaranteed in South Africa, it's all coal based. So again, we've been sold to fiction. Thank you.
Good point. Good point.
Is it cool if I ask before you? So, as I'm sure you're aware, Sean, the government released a draft of its integrated resource plan. After they received some feedback and some comments, they have now announced that they're redrafting it. But nonetheless, that draft from 2023 puts a big emphasis both in the medium term, which is about from now till 2030, and in the long term from 2030 up until 2050. They put a huge emphasis on carbon capture, storage, and utilization as a kind of clean coal technology that can be utilized to add to the energy mix alongside with renewable energy. So I'd just like to know if Tuit has a position on clean coal and on carbon capture and the kinds of obstacles that you face with carbon capture, because there have been complaints about leakage, about the geography, about the cost, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's going to become an increasingly intense issue, considering the ministry when it comes to the Department of Energy and Minerals. But yeah, the question of carbon capture, I think it'd be interesting to hear a response.
Yep.
Thanks. And thanks, Sean, for the presentation. So my question is just around this question of kind of infrastructure financing. Last night in the SONA, Ramaphosa kind of repeated the point over and over of innovative financing mechanisms for infrastructure, new financing models, and so on and so on. And we've heard that, or we know that this is planned, especially for transmission, with the massive amount of investment that has to happen in transmission lines. So my question is just, what has the kind of international experience around these kind of new financing mechanisms been for transmission? I imagine there's public-private partnerships and so on. And then kind of on a related note is, I'm also imagining that with greater kind of privatization, especially in transmission, there expects to be a return for the investors. No matter how that investment happens, they'll only invest if there's money to be made. But in South Africa, where almost half of the country is unemployed, surely it's kind of a non-starter. So yeah, maybe it's that second one is more of a comment, but also just, I guess, to ask if they are, if this is something that they are aware of, as in the ones who are pushing for this kind of policy proposals, or do you think it's kind of a blind spot?
Right.
Do we have any on the floor? If not, we have as I guess just closing this first round of questions, we have Edward Wetley, who's asking what progress has been made with the storage of solar and wind energy.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we can take that first round of questions, response, and see if there's any left over.
Thanks, comrades. Thanks for your questions. The answers could be 20 times longer than my initial opening presentation, so I better be a bit brief. Let's I think start with the technical challenges that we must own are embedded in all of these questions. Jeff referred to the sort of the price wars in electric vehicles. And then there's been a lot of discussion in recent years on what are the material inputs. I mean, the battery is so heavy that the vehicle has to be heavy. So you have literally a 1-ton vehicle to move a person who may weigh 60 kilograms, you know? So you've got this ridiculous concentration of energy. Yes, it's run, as you said, Jeff, on electricity, but there's some disturbing realities. One, of course, if you charge that battery with coal-fired power or gas-fired power, it's still it's still basically, it is better than oil and petroleum to do it, but the gains are so marginal that it's not a winning solution. So yes, you need to decarbonize electricity supply in order to get the full benefit of electric vehicles. The other thing I think that the data on what they call hybrid vehicles, as opposed to pure electric, is a lot of people still use gas. So in other words, they spend more time driving the car in petrol mode, if you like, because sometimes they forget to charge it, or they can't be bothered, or they haven't bought the Eskom, or whatever it may be. But then you know you got gas in the car. Gas is petrol for many people who are likely to own electric vehicles, which are mostly wealthy people. They don't mind, you know, they're not going to be counting the pennies when it comes to, am I going to save money on this? So, but I think where electric vehicles are taken off, China is one. There's another reason why China is a net importer of petroleum products. So it is really nervous about the future, and its economic growth is sustained mostly by imported coal and gas. So that's why it's building a nuclear fleet. That's why it's trying to electrify its transport system. That's why it's building some of the largest renewable energy facilities in the world. They're called renewable energy bases. They combine wind and solar. They're often in the Mongolian desert, and they are huge, 500 megawatts each. And so they're doing like way. If you took China out of the renewable energy picture, it doesn't look as impressive. So when you hear these numbers, oh, renewables, the market, most of it, the biggest country is China, and it's deploying it mostly on non-market terms. In other words, it's a public program, as are the transmission lines. So let's segue into that. So, you know, again, this is where basic planning, you know, we can all sit around and talk about is China socialist or not or whatever. I mean, I have my own opinions on that. I'm sure everybody does. But one thing that they have been very good at is planning for basic needs. So they was the first developing country to get 100% electrification. It could have stopped at 95%. It could have stopped at 95% and said, well, the rest of those villages out there that aren't very productive. But as part of the all China policy, they said, no, the central government will fund transmission extensions into every rural area, even ones that were more almost like medieval in some ways in terms of their social profile. So that what we've got in Europe and in South Africa is an opposite problem. So you have the independent power producers are not interested in, they don't consider doing the transmission their responsibility. They say our job is to bring power to the market, and your job is to buy it off of us through a power purchase agreement. End of story. It's not our problem. The balancing of the grid, the intermittency, because when the sun's not shining, all of that, that's your problem, not our problem. And I'll just illustrate this with an example before I answer what's going on with transmission in some other context. In Kenya, the government decided it was going to do a power purchase agreement with a wind farm, a very controversial wind farm, sometimes 400 megawatts. Loads of fights with rural communities against this wind farm. Leave that to one side. That's important, but leave it to one side for now. So the wind farm they then said, oh, if we're going to do this wind farm, 400 megawatts, then we need also to have transmission lines. So they said, well, where are we going to get the money to do the transmission lines? So they went to the government of Spain and said, can you lend us some money for transmission lines? because we have this wind farm under construction and we're going to have to pay the electricity as soon as that wind farm is constructed. We have to start paying regardless of whether that electricity is used. So they basically, the Spanish government said, of course we'll lend you some money at this level of interest. That's a concessional loan, but you have to use a Spanish company. So you have to use a Spanish company that happened to go bankrupt halfway through the project. So here we had a situation that for 2 years, comrades, power from wind turbines that were probably standing idle was being purchased by the utility, which is essentially the people, purchased by the utility even though it wasn't used, because that's what was in the contract. So what does Kenya do? It says, we're not doing this anymore. So it actually backfires on the energy transition. These arrangements make governments say, well, we don't need this. Maybe we'll do a bit of gas. Maybe we'll look at nuclear, maybe coal. Something that we know is, we don't need all these transmission infrastructure. But it's one of the biggest challenges, I think, and one of the biggest cock-ups, and I nearly used a stronger word, of neoliberal policy. And you read it in the literature, and I quoted it in some of the work I've been done in recent years. They said, we never asked the question, this is the World Bank, we never asked the question, who would be responsible for the energy planning, such as the transmission systems? We never asked the question. We thought the market was going to do the trick. Now, let's talk about South Africa's plan. So along comes the JET-P, which is to build up renewables, and that will require transmission lines in the tens of thousands of kilometers. Eskom has a budget for transmission lines, and it's saying it's not enough. So they have to mobilize this new company. There's now the new Eskom holding, whatever it's called, transmission company. I forget the name of it, ESK somewhere there, I can't remember what it is. Their policy now is they are going to do a public-private partnership model. And you might say, well, that sounds good. The private sector has the money, the Eskom has no money, so that'll be fine. So what they're saying, and I would suggest reading a document that Penny, I'm not sure, she's not here today, but Penny oh, is she? Penny, hi. Penny turned me on to this, she's at 31 years at Eskom, into this report called Better Financing, Better Grid. And it's a blended finance approach to the grid in South Africa. And it's basically saying blended finance. Blended is when you put concessional loans and commercial loans together in order to mobilize the private sector. So this thinking, as you know, Brian, what the World Bank calls it, billions to trillions. The idea that if development A, which is public money, is put on the table in the form of cheap loans, it will crowd in private investment. That's the model that's being proposed through the JET IP. That's the model being proposed through the Just Energy Transition partnerships with other countries. And I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I will say the data that presented in the CHUED paper is absolutely devastating. The amount of money, $1 of public development money, mobilizes 16 cents in sub-Saharan Africa from the private sector. So instead of billions bringing trillions, billions is bringing pennies, 16 cents. And that's the African Development Bank, which is the regional arm of the World Bank talking. This isn't me talking or some left NGO, this is real. In middle income countries, it's about 40, 50 cents on every dollar. So what we're seeing then is public money going in to subsidize the transition, private companies making money out of the public investment, but the country that might be putting in the money, or even the development putting the money, have no equity stake in the project whatsoever. So it becomes a giveaway. It's a pass-through of public money into private hands. It makes profitable what would not otherwise be profitable. That's what they call de-risking. Now, on transmission, it's the same. So you de-risk the investment in the case of generation through a power purchase agreement, which is guaranteed for you for 25 years. Then for transmission, it's like, oh, what are we going to do? They will probably do what they call an IPP model. It's ridiculous to call it that because it's not a power producer, it's a power transporter. So a company will come in, and they did this in the UK. They say, oh, we invested in this, we upgraded that. And then you look at the numbers and you find they put in a small amount of investment. And then they charge the utility to move the power from one end of the country to the other per megawatt hour. Remember, all the grid infrastructure in South Africa was built by public money. So there you're going to be using that infrastructure and charging a fee on top. So what it's doing is basically moving the problem from Eskom to the transmission system, which then will be in a situation where how is that transmission infrastructure and the profits that go along with it going to be paid for over a 25-year period? It's just going to add more debt to Eskom. So the government will then be faced with the same situation as it is now. Either you bail out Eskom or you allow it to go into further neglect and disrepair. So I think the transmission debate is very controversial and lively, not just in South Africa, Jacka, which I think is what you're suggesting. You know that you're right. You know that this is a big challenge in other parts of the world, and it will become a very big technical challenge. If in densely populated areas, how are you going to get large volumes of land dedicated to wind and solar is going to be a real problem. You've got countries like, for example, Bangladesh, which has needs all the arable land it can get in order to feed 180 million people. You start in the US, they say, I make more money growing solar panels than I do growing carrots. But the US is a much bigger country and less densely populated. Other parts of the world are going to be facing that. So I'm sorry, I was a bit sort of rambly around the transmission question, but on the financing mechanisms, which is, I find this quite entertaining. When I read, who's the head of the Presidential Climate Commission here? Minelli? He was talking about, anyway, I can't remember, he may have resigned now or gone over to finance. But they always talk about innovative financing instruments, but they never actually say what they are. They always talk about blended and de-risking but they rarely ever say what it means. But at the end of the day, there's no way around the fact that if you're going to use the private sector is going to want its pound of flesh, and it's going to want that guaranteed by sovereign governments. With the Indonesia Just Energy Transition Partnership, Indonesia will have to put aside $9 billion just in sovereign guarantees to get the money, the concessional loans from the International Partners Group of 20 billion. So it's a ludicrous situation because those innovative financing doesn't alter the fundamentals, which are if the private sector is going to come in, it's going to want to go out with more money than it came in the door with. And that is that's the crisis that confronts the energy transition. Because even with blended finance, even with subsidies, there's still risk for private companies. They don't know what's going to happen in the global energy system. They don't know whether the climate commitments made in Paris, the net zero commitments, are going to stand the test of time. So even if you get some concessional financing or you get a break from a government who guarantees to buy your power from you for 25 years, what happens if they do a Ghana on you and Ghana says we're cancelling the contract, we'll pay the compensation, get lost? If more and more countries do that, you can see how the whole energy transition to renewables in particular are compromised. Anyway, I should probably let others come in because I've spent a lot of time on those answers. Sorry about that.
Thanks again to Sean for, again, some very comprehensive answers. And now we have a very comprehensive question from Roland Ngam.
I didn't answer the story, so I'll come back to
Okay,
Edward's
great.
question. Sorry, Edward.
No problem. And the solar question. So I think we can take these two questions from Roland and open up the floor again if comrades and colleagues have another input or question. So Roland's, the first part of his question is, what are the implications for multilateral processes as well as resource-rich countries in the global south that require technology transfer partnerships with highly industrialized nations to transition to a low carbon economy? It's quite a pertinent question.
Get that
Yeah.
again? Sorry, Andy.
So what are the implications for multilateral processes as well as resource-rich economies in the global south that require technology transfer partnerships, with highly industrialized nations to transition to low carbon economies? And then the second question, again from Roland, is do you have suggestions on ownership models to end the slow privatization that we see in Africa? Um, there is a final question about how do you read developments in technology with small modular reactors, small modular coal plants, hydrogen, etc. Are there any questions on the floor or inputs from the floor? If not, we can shift because that's quite a lot. Yeah. If not, comrades, then we'll shift back to Sean.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll try to be a little briefer in the interest of getting others into the conversation. Thanks, Roland, for your question. And Ed, I want to come back to the storage question. At the moment, the battery storage is usually associated with behind-the-meter solar systems. And in countries like Germany, most new solar installations come with a battery. It's part of a package. But outside, but that's about, I think, the three largest European economies, Netherlands, our three largest storage deployers, if you like, are Germany, Netherlands, I can't remember the other one. It might be Spain. But they're about 80% of storage in the European Union, and it's all subsidized, basically saying it extends the power for 4 hours or so. Some of the new batteries are 5 hours, but they add a bit of electricity when the sun has gone down. The one issue though is a lot of countries have not done storage. Some of them haven't even done very much solar, and I'm referring to Europe now. The batteries are quite expensive. That shouldn't be an issue for us. We would find the lowest cost possible and do it on a non-profit basis. But the storage is lagging, like the transmission, the storage is lagging behind the renewables. So in only a few countries, Australia, Germany, there are solar systems being accompanied by storage, say 40, 50, 60% of systems being installed. In other countries, there's either none or there's a few percent. And so it's way, way behind. Again, lack of planning. You knew about storage batteries a long time ago. So why no storage? The storage companies, their attitude is very similar to the IPP model for transmission. Their thing is, we don't want to sell you a battery. We can make a battery and we can sell you a battery, but we want to make money selling flexibility services. In other words, we want the governments to commit to basically not purchasing the battery, but purchasing the service. So it's a little bit like your phone, right? You buy data, but the data is hitting your phone 24/7 anyway from the data towers. It's not like your phone is making any difference. It's just the economics of remuneration, they call it. In other words, how do you make money out of storage? And there's an argument going on. The European Union, which has basically got the most ambitious decarbonization agenda based on wind and solar, is saying that the storage companies have got to come into the picture and start doing storage. And the storage companies saying, yeah, but how do we make any money out of this? So this is the kind of the dilemma of storage. The other type of storage, of course, is pumped hydro storage, where you basically, I won't go into details, but it's most of the storage in the world today is where you basically pump water up a hill and then let it come back down again when you need the electricity. It's very simple technology, very effective, but there's only limited places in the world where you can do that. First of all, you need mountains. You need somewhere like Cape Town could do it pretty well. Again, Bangladesh wouldn't be able to do that because it doesn't have much by way of mountains or anything to allow for that pump storage to happen. So Roland's question, I wasn't absolutely entirely clear on it, but I'll take a shot at it. I mean, what I think is been recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the United Nations now for 25, 30 years is there needs to be technology transfer from the developed world to the less developed world if we're going to address the climate crisis. Unfortunately, that has not happened because, again, it's a commercial enterprise. So if you develop a new wind turbine blade that you think is going to be a high performance wind turbine generator or blade, you're not going to give that technology to another company, private or public, because that's your competitive advantage, as it were. So we have a situation where, and I'll use China again as an example, China, because it's got an energy shortage, because it has to import fossil fuels, have been pushing wind and solar, nuclear, and we'll probably take the lead on carbon capture. And I want to come back to Andilia's question. They've been pushing that in China. And I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about? Yes, tech transfer. So in China's case, they wanted to do offshore wind. They looked at Europe and they said, look, these people are doing offshore wind. There's, I think, something like 25 gigawatts of offshore wind now in the North Sea and couple of gigawatts in the Baltic. And that's been the big gamble in Europe, is to try to get as much offshore wind. But you need people who know how to do these offshore platforms. So that's why it's not a coincidence. Statoil, British Petroleum, those interests are involved in offshore wind because they know how to do that stuff. China didn't really know how to do that stuff, but they did it anyway, and they've got some of the best wind turbines in the world, and now they've gone past Europe's deployment in just 5-10 years. But China's a special case. First of all, it's got the legacy of planning. It's got government that will back these decisions, and it also has a sort of a human resource skills base that can do that stuff. They can reverse engineer it and do it. Other countries, the vast majority of the global south, don't have that option, and that's where part of our demands at the global level for a global public goods approach would say that these restrictions on essential environmental technologies have to be removed as part of a global Green New Deal. They have to be basically become public assets. And particularly, the case is particularly strong, not just because of climate and the climate emergency and how to address it, but because most of these research and development projects were publicly funded. So this is the logic of the last 30 years, is you put public money into research and development, and then you put it out for sale, and then someone comes along, slaps a patent on it, and now they own it. And then that's not a way to deal with this crisis of the lack of tech transfer from north to south. It happens on commercial terms. It should happen on non-commercial terms. The argument that, well, then who would invest in these companies if they are going to lose their competitive advantage and give away? That's their problem. Our problem is we got to decarbonize the power systems and the energy systems. So full public ownership of all the major technology suppliers may sound, it is a heavy lift politically, but without it, we're not going to get to the levels. You saw the charts of emissions and energy growth. We're not going to get to that. When shall I take the CCS argument? Should I do it now? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm hogging the microphone here. Carbon capture, just chew it up. First of all, what is it? I'm sure some comrades know or have a basic idea about it, what it is. It's basically the separation of CO2 at the point of combustion using either a chemical process or some other process that you can actually separate it and it doesn't go up into the atmosphere, basically. It doesn't take out, in terms of coal and gas, it doesn't take out the other particulates and other pollutants that can, carcinogenic materials, arsenic, all of that. It doesn't. So you don't actually, it's not a perfect technology, but it does take the CO2 out. Now, I would say that all technologies should be on the table and viewed through a lens of a public goods approach. If that technology can help, particularly in industrial processes where you need high temperatures, this is one of the big problems of renewables, is the voltage level is such that often you can't imagine how a steel mill can run on wind and solar power, for example. So this is why hydrogen is part of the debate, because you can store renewable energy in hydrogen. It's a very long-term plan, but the idea is you do need that energy intensity to make industrial products. And this is why the debate on carbon capture came out. It wasn't just the power stations, it was also industrial processes. Now, what's the state of carbon capture technologies today? Again, looking beneath the headlines, you'll see that around about 2010, again, after the financial crash, 2009, 2010, governments, as part of their green growth strategy, started putting a lot of public money into public-private partnerships with companies to develop these technologies. But it was always never at commercial scale. It was always pilot studies. And of course, they were at the optimal conditions. First of all, you need somewhere to store the carbon once you separated it. So in the case of the UK, they stored it in the hollowed out craters underneath the North Sea that used to contain oil and gas. So they basically stick a pipe down there like a drinking straw and pump high pressure CO2 into these basically caves under the water. So you've got somewhere to store it. I think there's a number of problems confronting it. First and foremost, there's not a single commercial scale power station in the world that has carbon capture installed. So what the industry says is that we will make new coal-fired power stations carbon capture ready. Again, the word ready is one of those innocuous words that you think, oh, they're doing carbon capture. If you read that article quickly, you would think it was a technology that was available, but it's not. What they do is they leave a space in the middle of a coal-fired power station for when the technology is ready. But the technology isn't ready. And who will develop the technology unless there's a market for it? So the only conceivable way of getting a market for it, this is what the industry says, is if the price of carbon is over 120 euros a ton, which it's a quarter of that, even in Europe. So without a high carbon price, there's no incentive for power stations to invest in the technologies. So therefore, the technologies don't get developed to commercial scale. So in a nutshell, carbon capture has been discussed now for 25 years, and it's barely got off the runway. Yes, they'll announce with some fanfare a new project, but the reality is the capitalist approach to it is not a public goods model. It basically says we need to be able to sell this technology to a market that needs to be guaranteed for us to develop it. We wouldn't take that approach, would we? We would say, if this technology can work, let's try it in one or two power stations. Let's see if it works. Where do we put the carbon? Let's see how we overcome that problem. In other words, it's a problem to be solved. I don't think it's an easy problem to be solved, but it's something that is in the discourse. And we had the conversation with some comrades from a certain union who often refers to carbon capture as an option. And they clearly are, want to do the best for South Africa, do the best for the South African people. But there's a lot of misconceptions about carbon capture out there that need to be corrected. And in the left, we have to take ownership of that as well. Sorry for going on too long.
Thank you for those responses. More questions from Zoom keep filing in.
I didn't get the small modular
Oh, yes,
reactors.
the small modulator reactors, yeah. Once again, comrades, the floor is open. Yes, Greg.
Maybe others want to come in on the ownership model question, because, otherwise I'll go for another 15 minutes. Sorry? Oh, good. Right. Hi, Penny. I see your hand up.
Thanks very much, Sean. My question is,
What's your name, comment?
I'm Greg.
Greg.
Greg. My question is in relation to the kind of vision you outlined for social, or the need for public ownership. Sometimes you talk about renationalization. I imagine those kind of capture similar movements. And my question is that kind of the end point of the vision? Is it a kind of transitional vision? Because the way I see it is a kind of renationalization or public ownership deals with the issue that these things are privately owned at the moment. But it doesn't deal with the issue that they would still be produced for profit, even if they were publicly owned. And how do you factor that in? Is it something that you consider? And I think it kind of, there's similar parallels for me with what happened with workers in the universities with insourcing. You know, workers were insourced, and that was supposed to change everything because their employer changed and it was no longer these small private companies, but now they were part of the university and they were employed in maybe not quite the public sector, but I would imagine the same kind of process would happen with workers employed in energy sectors. It's kind of just changing the employer from private owners to a state employer.
Yep. Yeah. Good question. Good question.
Another quick check up around the public pathways, as you suggest that it's urgently needed. So I'm checking if is that still vertically or with vertically integrated approach, or what should entail that public pathways?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question.
Hello. I don't know whether you've addressed this one already. There's a journalist who said, as far as the electrical cars are concerned, he doesn't foresee South African manufacturers coming to the market because it's quite small, and B is we don't have reliable electricity, and then you need plants where cars can plug in and plug them quickly and so on. So that one is said not for in the next 3 to 5 years in that one. The other one that I haven't heard being discussed is this question of the grid. Now, everybody wants to generate renewable. And the last time I heard this, they said is that they're not sure whether the grid has got capacity to accommodate all this. Now, there's a company that in Mpumalanga, he said they consider building a new grid, parallel grid, but it will be private. I don't know what's your take on that, on the grid to accommodate all this renewable energy and so on. Thank you.
There's just, we have a hand from Penny, but before we get to that, Tony Martel had raised an interesting political question. And they're keen to know in your experience, what are workers' views across the context in which you've worked? Is there a diversity of views within that context? And maybe if you can, what are the positions that do unify workers? And then I think we can close this off with Penny. Yeah.
Hi, are you asking me to speak? Good morning, everyone, or are we waiting for Sean to give a response? Hello?
There she is.
Can you hear me?
Yes, the floor is yours, Penny.
Hi, great. Good morning, and sorry for joining so late. I got my times mixed up. I'm out of the country, and I didn't realize it was so late or so early. Anyway, thanks for that. I'm so sorry I've missed your presentation. So I'm going to come into this cold, Sean, but I'm looking forward to viewing the recording later if you're going to make it available. But yeah, ownership models for me are a bit of a passion. And I do want to speak about the grid, but just talking about ownership models in general. I mean, the ownership models are very much linked, in my opinion, to what has been a transformation of the financial sector, where one, and maybe you've touched on this, Sean, so tell me to keep quiet if I need to, where you've looked at the way, governments have been able to, generally worldwide, access bond markets, and then use those funds to invest in infrastructure. Now, there obviously are discussions around the fiscal constraints and all of that. I'm not going to go into that. But what we've seen is that the transition from a government, a kind of bond market access, and we can see the lack of access in South Africa at the moment as well, to funds and private equity accessing accessing the funding market, and that is largely how does one call it? So there's the predatory kind of environment as far as access to funding is concerned. So when you look at ownership, and it's very interesting on the transmission grid as well, it's normally raised with regard to a private sector is going to invest, but what one doesn't realize is that it's not only investing money as via the bond market, it's actually investing via ownership models. And I think there's a lack of understanding of that, just generally in a broader public space. I think what is understood in South Africa is that it means private sector ownership, but I don't think we're being honest about private sector ownership, except if you start looking at some of the stuff I think that came out of SONA recently, and I didn't listen to it, I've just been looking at comments, where the president now is talking about private sector investment, or being able to make space for the private sector. So I'm particularly concerned about ownership of the grid. And one can talk about concession models and things like that. I've been involved in concessions, and I can tell you it is privatization. And once the private sector owns that, there'll be a lot of stuff behind the scenes, from a contractual point of view, where all the risks associated with the grid, and let's face it, there are numerous grid risks in the new space, right? In the transition space, because as Sean was saying earlier, there's batteries that are needed. There's a lot of services that are needed, and these are all going to cost money. And what I see is that the private sector will come on and say, well, we'll invest. All we want is our cake and eat it. We'd like the returns to be guaranteed, and we don't want to take on any risks. I've actually seen some of the risk allocation frameworks that are being mooted by some of these investors. And at the end of the day, the de-risking conversation, which I'm sure you've raised, is going to become a really big one as far as the grid is concerned. And the further issue that I have with regard to the grid is that I think if one has a look strategically from an asset point of view, it's a key what would call in the old language a key national key point. And the grid in the past in South Africa was defined as a national asset, national key point, and there are huge security issues around the grid and how it operates and access to information. So there's a much broader conversation that needs to be had in South Africa about grid ownership. And what I do see, I mean, you just look at articles that came out over SONA. I see a huge push from the media, and I'm sure this is coming from somewhere. Engineering News this morning has a headline: Ramaphosa moots innovative investment models for grid as he reiterates support for power and logistics. Now, the media is bringing more and more this grid narrative as a headline, hidden amongst a whole lot of other stuff. And if you have a look, and maybe I'm talking a bit out of turn, but I want to get this off my chest. You listen to the Minister of Electricity's feedback. He keeps on dropping in bits and pieces associated with the grid and who they're talking to at the WEF, and the banks are going to also contribute. And I just feel that the space for input and consultation is terribly scarce and not clear, and we really need to start tackling from a South African perspective what public consultation really means, because the public consultation is, yeah, everybody can have their say, but how it gets taken up is a veritable mess. I mean, we gave input into the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on the ERA, the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill, and we just got fobbed off, right? I know we raised valid issues, and it had to do with some of the stuff to do with privatization, but also largely about the governance in the space. The governance is, I mean, it's concerning. There's an absolute lack of governance, and it's a free fall. So I think there's a bigger conversation to be had in South Africa at this point in time as to how we go about influencing and contributing and questioning, I think what is called, I think it's section 195 of the Constitution, which makes provision for public consultation and question how public consultation will actually work. And I specifically, again, want to get back to the grid, because as we've seen in the private sector, as far as generation is concerned, initially it was only going to be 30%, and now the whole model has changed. But there's been no consultation on how things moved, you know, where did they get here? It was soft and it was creeping, right? It's creeping over ownership of public sector goods, public sector assets. And we know how important these things are. And I'm not sure, Sean, whether you talked about it. I sort of heard a bit about it when I started listening to the piece that you were talking about on storage, but the financialization of the sector is unbelievable. It's not necessarily about the assets themselves. It's about how to financialize them and how to make money and have a revenue stream that is not that's indirectly linked to these assets. And it's scary. And you can go and have a look at the examples in the global north. They're all grappling with this, but South Africa is being forced down a path without taking a step back and saying, okay, what strategically does the country want to achieve? Who do we want to invest? How do we want to regulate those? If you look at the regulation and ownership of the private sector generation assets, as I said before in one of the presentations I've made, those assets have been sold off, a lot of them. Those initial investors like Actis via its Lekela platform on generation, who were first to market in South Africa, got huge tariffs. I mean, they're above R4 on their PV the PV plants initially. They sold all their assets off last year, and some of those assets are now, amongst others, and I'm not saying Actis ownership is good, but some of those assets are now owned by the Nigerian pension fund and some rich guy in Egypt. And so ownership is not transparent. I tried via NERSA to ask them about the ownership, the transfers of ownership, because they do put it out on their website saying, you know, you can comment on this. I asked them, so what, you know, give me some more detail. They wouldn't. They just ignored me. So, you know, we actually powerless at the moment. Because I don't think we have sufficient coherence. And I'm really looking to Sean and the AIDC and those that associate with the AIDC to really drive some questions on where we find ourselves in the energy space and the transition space. And I'll stop there because I've said a whole lot and I hope I haven't confused you all, but thanks for inviting me.
No, it's not so much a question. I think the issue of finance is absolutely crucial to this discussion. So I think Penny makes a very, very important point about financialization. And that means that we've got to understand the changes that have taken place within capitalism itself. Because this phenomena of developing an asset, not necessarily in terms of what the asset does, but how it can be financed, because it's in the financing of infrastructure. It's not in the dam or the power plant or whatever is developed. It's in the financing where the profits are being made. It's in the securitization of it, in its the derivatives that flow from it, etc. That whole process has become a dominant process within capital, and has given us a outcome in which there's been a massive transfer of wealth um, in the form of capital from the public to the private over several decades now, such that the state becomes dependent upon going to the bond market or the other equity markets, etc., to raise finance, rather than from what was done traditionally. And let's look at how the electricity sector was developed in South Africa. It was developed through the process of taxation. It came out of public funds taxing corporations and individuals to develop the electricity sector in here, to build the power lines, to build the grid, to build the plants, and so on and so forth. That's how it developed. Now we are suggesting, or it is being suggested, that we have to accept a different model. Now, I take the point that Greg makes, that, just public doesn't, doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It solves some problems. So what I think what you're wanting to be able to do is to be able to impose a regime in which you can generate, accumulate, acquire the resources in which to do what we need to have done. So here in South Africa, we need to solve energy poverty, to decarbonize, to industrialize, because we are deindustrializing. We need to generate a shitload of additional electricity. How are we going to pay for it? Well, I would say we should do what the National Party did and impose prescribed assets on the big corporations and financial sector and say, you will be investing in this nationally crucial project for the economy. Now, that's one aspect of becoming less dependent on the equity and the bond markets and so on, which I think is absolutely essential. Is that enough? I don't think it's enough. I think we have a massive gap between the resources that are needed, not just for electricity, but for other social purposes. That puts the whole question of ownership, and I'm here not referring to who owns the grid and so on and so forth. Important issues that Penny and others have raised. But you need to take control of the wealth of the country to sort out the urgent needs, not least the crisis of the climate. And I think that's where we've got to. That this model of green growth, the neoliberal approach to climate, etc., is completely failing. But we're powerless because the notion of nationalizing and taking the wealth of important sectors of the economy into public hands and redirecting that towards these important social requirements is too horrible to contemplate in the ideological world that we live in today, such that you get this expression that it's easier to accept that it's the end of the world rather than the end of capitalism. But actually, it's the inroads that we have to make into capitalism that is absolutely crucial, and we just don't want to confront that problem, so that the solutions that we put forward are kind of dismissed. And so we go back and get trapped within the neoliberal mode of thinking. And I think this is the value of Sean's input, is it shows us that we've come to a real cul-de-sac, and the contradictions are becoming so apparent through the lens of the climate crisis. But that's not the only and the most prevalent problems that one faces in the day-to-day of South Africa. So the same kind of thinking has to be approached to a comprehensive way in which we deal with the extreme levels of inequality, mass unemployment, and so on. If we're going to think that we can solve unemployment through, profit making, I think we basking up the same misnomer and tree than trying to solve climate through profit making and profit maximization.
Thank you to Brian and to all of the participants who raised inputs. I will close the inputs and questions for this seminar. Give Sean a moment to respond. And perhaps, Sean, if you want, you can also add some concluding remarks as well.
Sure thing. Yeah, great. Thanks, comrades. First of all, I defer to Brian and Penny on the financialization question. It stretches the limits of my own knowledge, to be honest. But when I look at, for example, the whole climate finance debate and this idea that was in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in the early 1990s, was there would be a provision of capital from north to south. Now the language has changed, and it started with Hillary Clinton in 2009, where she said we will mobilize capital from the north to the south through a collection of different sources, public and private. Now, so provision then becomes access. So in other words, we're not going to give you money to pay our ecological debt. We cause the problem of climate change, but you're going to have to borrow money from us. We might give you a concessional loans here and there, but you're going to have to pay it back with interest. And you've got to open up your electricity systems and your green economy generally to the private sector. So that's what's on the agenda. That's green structural adjustment. So taking on board what Penny and Brian have said about financialization, I get it, and I agree totally. But the crisis consists in the fact that for every $5 of investment in the so-called green economy, 4 are in the rich countries. So where all the energy use or the growth in energy use, particularly fossil fuels, are in the Asia Pacific region and the global south more generally, then what we don't have, we have this massive investment gap. So someone's not making any money out of this, can't see any money in the deal. And I'll quote pretty closely or paraphrase Christina Georgieva, the head of the International Monetary Fund, who a year ago said, why would you, a private investor, invest in what she called the emerging and developing economies? Why would you do that? There's no reason for you to do it. So we have to sweeten the deal for these guys. Those are her exact words. We have to sweeten the deal for these guys. In other words, across the board de-risking of investment. To the point, and Brian and I were discussing a podcast over this Bridgetown initiative on financing that comes out of Barbados. And the guy who designed it, he was a real kind of neoliberal Harvard type, Yale type. He basically, he points out that the de-risking that is going on now to try to attract capital to the global south is such that your government could be taken to court in a jurisdiction outside of your own country and basically be required to pay fines and compensation and everything else. He says, like, we are already de-risking more than the global north is doing for its own investors. So this de-risking model, and Daniela Gabor wrote a good paper on it recently, New Washington Consensus, and I think it's something that we should drill down on more for Wall Street, the new, what did I say? Oh yeah, the new Wall Street Consensus, and the kind of the idea that we're going to de-risk our way to an energy transition is not panning out in the way that they are imagining it, and but again, it's beyond the sort of the breadth of my own knowledge on this. So on the question then of the public pathway and the question of profit for public or private, I agree with what Greg said. If we're just saying, well, let's go back to public ownership, we're not going to get a transition. You know, some of the biggest coal, oil, and gas companies in the world are publicly owned. They are basically, some of them are making loads of money. They're public. Let's say Sinopec in China, for example. They are a major investor in energy all over the world. So these companies are very, even though they're formally public owned, they are operating in a system of a marketized system. They've become marketized. Eskom was marketized beginning in the early 90s. Had to trade on the stock exchange. It had to pay dividends. Had to pay taxes. So all of this comes with the territory of marketization. So the public pathway approach is not just public ownership of energy, it's the demarketization of public entities so that they can serve not just public good, the public good in the immediate sense, but the long-term sense of economy-wide decarbonization using all available technologies on the basis of human need, not private profit. That's got to be the sort of the vision of a demarketized public system. And the historical evidence of public energy is a good resource for us because it showed that basically if it was left to private markets, there would be no electricity for ordinary people anywhere in the world today, because there's no way a private investor is going to be building power generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure without knowing who's going to pay for the electricity. And it sometimes takes, and we've seen for across the global south and the global north before it, provision of electricity is the beginning of economic development in many ways, but other basic infrastructure. But it takes a number of years before electricity is built up enough that you can open up, you know, a car wash or a nail salon or a internet cafe, if they still have internet cafes. You know, that kind of thing requires a level of development. But you won't get there until you provide the electricity. So the electricity has to come before the development. And the pioneers of public energy knew that the value in public energy is not in the electrons. This idea that the electrons have the value is ludicrous. The value is in what you can do with electricity, which is improve quality of life, run a clinic, run a school, all of those things. Go to the dentist and not have them pull out your teeth with pliers. That's the value of electricity. And that was known through the middle period of the last century, right up until the 1980s, until the neoliberal counter-revolution, which was to privatize everything. So I think the public pathway is a theory of transition, of trying to get from here to there, understanding that that is got to be a collective process where we all share our knowledge, but we understand the problems, that we don't entertain ideas that can't be backed up by facts. And as comrades who've had conversations with me will know, I'm very annoyed by people who say community energy is an alternative to big public systems. Because I read an article just last week. It had listed all the community energy projects you could ever imagine that's in the news in any part of the world. And it never used the term megawatt. In other words, how much electricity they refer, and I'm sorry to go off on this sort of rant about it, in my hometown, Brooklyn, New York, 2 miles away from where I live, there is a solar system on a rooftop that is owned cooperatively, it generates, it's about the size of a football field. That is being presented as a model of community energy. They said it's the first of its kind. It's the first of its kind is because there is not a second one. And the reason why there's not a second one, and the reason why there won't be another one, is because it was all done on public subsidies. Nothing wrong with subsidizing good things, but it's not a model. And it won't be a model. So we have to get out of our minds this idea, whereas we want communities to be involved in all the delivery of all services and make democratic decisions. With the power sector, it's a particular set of challenges that come with that. We can't, power is going to be generated 1,000 kilometers away sometimes, 2,000 kilometers away. Who makes the decision about that? So local production, local has its place, but it's not a model, which I think takes up the question vertically or horizontally integrated, or how we do that. My sense is, and I'm not an engineer, and I defer to those who know this, but my sense is behind the meter distributed generation has a significant role to play in a decarbonized power system. In some countries and regions, it could have a very big role to play, but it cannot be the model of a future power system in a modern economy. Just not, to me, not conceivable, which is why all the technologies that are in some way, all the technologies have strengths and weaknesses. And I think we should get away from the narrative often promoted in the climate justice movement, and I love those people, that says that there are, we don't want false solutions. We have to reject false solutions. And that includes carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear power, big hydro systems, yada, yada, yada. Anything that's big is a false solution. But little is good. And it's the leftovers of the small is beautiful argument of the 60s and 70s. But we all know little is not always good and big is not always ugly. We have to have a class approach to it, look at the technologies. When there are, and say, look, there are no false solutions because there are no correct solutions in the sense that everything, that one technology or even a cluster of technologies can solve all problems and have no negative effects. We're seeing that with renewables. We've seen it with coal, oil, and gas. There are issues around nuclear. So this debate around technologies needs to be seen through the lens of public ownership and development and of democratic input on the deployment of those technologies. But there will be no easy way to decarbonize a system that's got globally, Penny, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 7,200 gigawatts of installed capacity globally, most of it in fossil fuels. Replacing that power with clean energy, low carbon energy, is a 30-year proposition, and it needs to be carefully planned. It needs to be done on non-market terms, and it needs to be part of a planned transition away from high carbon polluting energy to low carbon energy. So I think I probably over-talked, and I'll stop there.
There's an important question from Tony about.
Oh, Tony, sorry.
What workers' views are.
Oh, yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'll quick. That's been happening a lot. Anyway, yeah, Tony, workers' views, very important. I get a feeling if you're in the power sector, there's still strong support for public ownership, even amongst those who've seen privatization. And I just came from Indonesia, where they really want to defend their public utility, not because they think they love coal, it's because the IPPs coming in, have come in for the last 20, 30 years, have had a really bad effect on electricity prices. And with the JET-P with Indonesia, they're coming with very, very stringent conditions about limiting the role of PLN, which is the Eskom of Indonesia, to being a consumer of electricity, not a producer. So this is the battle. They understand the dangers, and I think that's but that's not true everywhere. You know, let's be honest, some unions who went through and survived privatization are doing better now, fewer but better in terms of certainly UK. The energy unions resisted Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto commitment to renationalize energy. But they were won over when they saw what was happening in the power systems and the profit making. But it took a while to get them to support the renationalization. Mexico is another good example. I think, again, the national sovereignty, energy independence was being put forward by the government or by the president in his campaign. And on the commemoration of May Day a couple of years ago, the president said, please come out and support our effort to take our energy back. And 1 million people showed up in Mexico City. So this is quite popular idea. It's not always linked to climate. It's not always linked to renewables, but it is a basic thing. I think a lot of working class people understand that basic services like energy should be public, and that when the profiteers get in the mix, then very little good will come of it. So I'm hoping that's encouraging. We can talk more about that, Tony. There we go. It is, isn't it? Yeah. Solar panels on those wings, man.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Sean Sweeney. And thank you to everyone who attended via Zoom and people who were able to make it here in person. The recording will be available, and we have the contact details of those who signed up for the Zoom, so we can send them those. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy has a website. It's just a quick Google search. You can find them there and many of the materials that they produce and get a deeper understanding of the work that Sean and his comrades are involved in. And thank you to Jeff for organizing, and Musi and Yako for the technical assistance and setup as well. And with that, comrades, I think we can call this seminar to an end, but hopefully we'll have more of these kinds of urgent and engagements on these kinds of critical issues going forward. Yeah, thanks everyone on Zoom.
Well done, AIDC.